I used to think that the worst thing about living in an isolated cabin in the deep woods was the wildlife, or maybe the complete lack of cell service. I was wrong. The real danger of being surrounded by miles of dense, whispering trees isn't what's trying to break into your house from the outside. It's what happens when the forest decides to move inside with you, twisting your reality until you can no longer trust your own senses or the very passage of time. My name is Ryan, and 2 years ago, I bought a small, two-bedroom cabin nestled deep within the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. It was meant to be my creative sanctuary, a place where I could escape the relentless noise of Seattle and focus on my freelance graphic design work. The property was beautiful but profoundly isolated. The nearest paved road was a 3-mile drive down a winding, unlit dirt track, and my closest neighbor lived nearly 5 miles away. For the first few months, the absolute silence of the woods was exactly what I needed. I established a comfortable, predictable routine. I would wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and work at my desk facing the large glass windows that looked out into the thick canopy of pine and fir trees. The subtle anomalies began during the first week of October. It started with the local wildlife completely vanishing. The constant chatter of blue jays and the chattering of squirrels that usually filled the morning air suddenly ceased, leaving behind a heavy, unnatural quiet. When I stepped out onto my back deck, the air felt thick and completely stagnant, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Later that afternoon, I noticed the first physical disruption. I had left my car keys on the kitchen counter right next to my wallet, but when I went to grab them to drive into town for groceries, they were missing. After a frustrating 20-minute search, I found them sitting neatly in the center of my unmade bed upstairs. I lived entirely alone, and I was certain I hadn't been upstairs since waking up, but I brushed it off as a momentary lapse in memory. By mid-October, the disturbances escalated from inconvenient to deeply unsettling. One evening, while working late at my desk, I heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth on the gravel driveway outside. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed a flashlight, walked to the front door, and flicked on the outdoor porch lights. The gravel driveway was completely empty. There were no cars, no wild animals, and no tracks in the fresh dirt. Yet, the moment I turned off the porch light and locked the door, the heavy, rhythmic pacing on the gravel started up again, right outside the window. This time it didn't stay outside. As I stood paralyzed in the dark hallway, I heard the exact same crunching sound of gravel transitioning seamlessly into the soft thud of footsteps walking across the hardwood floor of my living room, just a few feet away from me. I scrambled to turn on the hallway light, and the sound instantly vanished. The living room was empty, but the air felt ice cold, and the distinct smell of damp earth and rotting pine needles filled the enclosed space. The following night, the entity began to directly manipulate my perception of reality. I was jolted awake at precisely 3:14 a.m. by the sound of my own voice calling out my name from the downstairs kitchen. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was my exact vocal inflection, loud and clear, shouting, "Ryan, come down here." Terrified, I grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the bedroom closet and crept to the top of the stairs. As I stared down into the pitch-black lower level, I saw a tall, unnaturally thin shadow figure standing at the base of the staircase. It didn't possess any facial features, but I could feel its intense, hostile gaze fixed directly on me. The most horrific part was its movement. It didn't walk or glide. It moved in jagged, staccato bursts, appearing 2 steps higher on the staircase every time I blinked, defying the laws of physics. Panicking, I slammed my bedroom door shut, locked it, and pushed my heavy wooden dresser against the frame. I sat on my bed, clutching the fireplace poker, waiting for the door to be kicked in. Instead, the room fell dead silent. I checked my phone to call for help, but the screen displayed a garbled mess of shifting characters, and the digital clock was rapidly spinning backward. Time itself had become completely unmoored. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like seconds. When I finally gathered the courage to look at the bedroom window, I realized the reflection in the glass wasn't matching my actions. I was sitting perfectly still on the bed, but my reflection was standing right at the glass, staring back at me with a wide, unnatural grin, slowly raising its hand to press against the pane. I spent the rest of the night trapped in a waking nightmare, listening to the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the roof directly above my head, accompanied by a low, mocking whisper that seemed to echo from the very walls of the cabin. When the morning sun finally broke through the trees, the heavy atmosphere instantly lifted. The digital clock reset itself to the correct time, and my reflection returned to normal. I didn't even bother to pack my clothes. I grabbed my wallet, ran to my car, and drove away from that mountain as fast as the dirt road would allow. I abandoned the cabin and put it on the market a week later. The real estate agent recently called to tell me that potential buyers refuse to step inside because they claim they can hear a man's voice calling out their names from the empty woods surrounding the property. That was just the beginning. The next incident will make you question the shadows in your own room. There is a specific type of vulnerability that comes with renting an isolated cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. You are deliberately placing yourself miles away from civilization, surrounded by a vast, untamed wilderness where no one can hear you scream if things go wrong. I learned that lesson the hard way last autumn, during what was supposed to be a relaxing solo fishing trip. My name is Emily, and I had rented a secluded, rustic cabin through an online hosting site. The property was located in a dense, heavily forested valley near the border of Oregon. According to the listing, the cabin sat on 40 acres of private timberland, surrounded by old-growth forest. The nearest town was a 45-minute drive away, and there was absolutely no cell service or internet access available. That isolation was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to disconnect from the digital world and spend my days hiking and fishing along the river that ran through the edge of the property. When I arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, the cabin looked picture perfect, nestled under a canopy of towering redwoods. The first indication that something was deeply wrong with the property occurred on my very first night. I had spent the evening reading by the stone fireplace and decided to turn in around 10:30 p.m. The bedroom was located on the second floor, with a large window that overlooked the dark forest line. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up abruptly a few hours later with an intense feeling of dread. The cabin was freezing cold despite the fire I'd built downstairs. As I lay still under the blankets, I heard the distinct sound of a faucet running downstairs in the kitchen. I assumed I had simply failed to turn it off completely before bed, so I got up to fix it. When I reached the kitchen, the faucet was completely dry. However, the heavy wooden dining chair, which I had neatly pushed under the table before bed, was now sitting directly in the center of the kitchen floor, facing the dark hallway. I pushed the chair back to its original position, feeling a sudden chill run down my spine, and went back upstairs. But the moment my head hit the pillow, I heard the loud, unmistakable sound of the dining chair being forcefully dragged across the hardwood floor downstairs. It was a harsh, scraping sound that echoed through the quiet house. I lay frozen in bed, listening as the sound traveled across the kitchen into the living room and stopped right at the base of the stairs. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of footsteps ascending the wooden steps, but the house fell completely silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, keeping my eyes locked on the open bedroom doorway. The next day, the anomalous activity moved outside into the forest. I decided to walk down to the river to clear my head, hoping that the fresh air would dispel my growing paranoia. The trail was narrow, winding through massive, ancient trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. About a mile into the woods, the ambient sound of the forest completely died out. The wind stopped blowing, and the constant rustling of the leaves ceased entirely. Then I heard it. A voice sounding exactly like my mother called out my name from the thick brush to the left of the trail. "Emily, over here, come look at this," the voice said. My mother was hundreds of miles away in California. A wave of intense panic washed over me as I realized the voice was completely devoid of emotion, sounding like a hollow, mechanical imitation of her speech pattern. I turned around and began walking rapidly back toward the cabin, refusing to look into the dense trees. As I walked, the voice followed me, shifting positions with impossible speed. 1 second it would whisper my name from a bush right next to my left shoulder, and the next second it would shout from the high branches of a tree 50 yards behind me. The forest itself began to feel distorted, as if the trail was stretching out indefinitely. A walk that should have taken 15 minutes felt like it lasted for hours. When I finally burst through the tree line and saw the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single window on the front of the cabin was wide open, and the white curtains were billowing out into the cold air. I knew for a fact that I had locked every window before leaving. I ran inside, locked the front door, and immediately began packing my bags. I couldn't stay there another night. As I was throwing my clothes into my suitcase in the upstairs bedroom, the bedroom door slammed shut with incredible force. The brass lock clicked into place on its own. I ran to the door and rattled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when the room went entirely dark, even though it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon outside. The large window showed nothing but absolute blackness, as if the forest had completely enveloped the cabin. From the corner of the room behind the closet door, I heard the sound of low, raspy breathing. A shadow figure, darker than the unnatural blackness of the room, slowly detached itself from the wall and began to glide toward me. It didn't have a human shape. It was a shifting, chaotic mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. As it neared the bed, I felt an overwhelming weight press down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe or scream. In a moment of pure survival instinct, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from my bag and hurled it directly through the bedroom window. The glass shattered, and the moment the cool outside air rushed into the room, the darkness vanished, the door unlocked itself, and the bright afternoon sun flooded back through the broken pane. I scrambled out of the window onto the porch roof, slid down the support pillars, and sprinted to my car. I drove down that mountain road without ever looking back, leaving half of my belongings behind. The vacation rental company later issued me a full refund without any explanation, and when I checked the listing a week later, the cabin had been completely removed from the website. If your heart is already racing, take a deep breath. Because our final story is the one that no one survived to tell. The woods have a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you are alone in the dead of winter. The shadows look longer, the snow muffles the sounds of the world, and the complete isolation can make you question your own sanity. But sometimes the things you see and hear in the dark aren't figments of your imagination. Sometimes the wilderness itself is alive, and it wants you to notice it. My name is Marcus, and last winter, I accepted a job as a winter caretaker for a remote luxury estate located deep in the dense forests of northern Maine. The property belonged to a wealthy family who only used it during the summer months, leaving it entirely vacant for the rest of the year. My duties were simple. I had to live in the small guest house on the property, shovel the snow off the main house roof, ensure the pipes didn't freeze, and keep an eye out for trespassers. The estate was completely surrounded by hundreds of miles of protected state forest, and the nearest town was a grueling 2-hour drive through treacherous, snow-covered mountain passes. I was provided with a snowmobile, a satellite phone for emergencies, and enough canned food to last until spring. The first 3 weeks passed without incident. The forest was buried under 4 feet of pristine white snow, and the absolute silence of the wilderness was incredibly peaceful. But everything changed on the night of January 12th, during a massive blizzard that knocked out the main generator. The guest house was plunged into total darkness, and the temperature inside began to drop rapidly. I lit a battery-powered lantern and went downstairs to the basement to check the electrical panel. As I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs, I noticed a trail of wet, melted snow forming perfect bare footprints on the concrete floor. The footprints led directly from the solid stone wall of the basement, crossed the room, and stopped right behind the furnace. There were no entry points, no broken windows, and the basement door had been locked from the inside. I followed the tracks with my lantern, my breath frosting in the freezing air. When I shone the light behind the furnace, there was nothing there, but the air suddenly became heavy with the suffocating scent of ozone and burning wood. Suddenly, the satellite phone in my pocket began to ring violently. I pulled it out, confused because the device required a clear line of sight to the sky to receive calls, which was impossible from a concrete basement. I answered it, and a voice on the other end, sounding exactly like my own voice, spoke to me in a frantic whisper. "Don't look up, Marcus. It's on the ceiling right above you." A wave of primal terror hit me. Slowly, against my better judgment, I tilted the lantern upward. Plastered against the concrete ceiling of the basement was a massive shifting shadow that perfectly mimicked the shape of a human being, but its limbs were stretched out at impossible broken angles. The moment the lantern light hit it, the entity let out a high-pitched, deafening screech that sounded like tearing metal. The lantern bulb exploded, plunging me into absolute darkness. I scrambled up the basement stairs in a panic, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me and locking it with the deadbolt. I ran to the living room, my heart hammering against my chest, and tried to use the satellite phone to call for help, but the screen was dead. I looked out the large glass windows into the blizzard, hoping the storm would die down so I could reach the snowmobile. Instead, I saw something that made me drop the phone completely. Standing out in the raging snowstorm just 10 feet from the window were dozens of identical shadow figures. They were all standing perfectly still in the deep snow, their featureless faces turned directly toward the guest house. As I watched in horror, the figures began to move in perfect unison, taking a single synchronized step closer to the window every time the wind howled. The paranormal escalation didn't stop there. The walls of the guest house began to creak and groan as if under immense pressure, and the framed photographs of the estate's owners hanging on the walls began to violently spin upside down on their own. Time itself completely fractured. I checked my wristwatch, and the second hand was moving backward, while the digital clock on my stove was rapidly flashing a sequence of random, nonsense numbers. The entire house felt like it was being pulled out of reality and into a pocket of absolute isolation, where the normal rules of the universe no longer applied. I retreated to the master bedroom on the top floor, barricading the door with a heavy oak desk. I huddled in the center of the bed, wrapping myself in blankets as the temperature inside the room plummeted far below freezing. Suddenly, the heavy wooden desk barricading the door began to slide across the floor on its own, pushed by an invisible immense force. The bedroom door slowly creaked open, revealing the dark hallway outside. From the darkness, the entity began to speak, using a horrific amalgamation of voices I recognized. My mother, my childhood friends, and finally, my own voice, all speaking in perfect, eerie synchronization. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus. Open the door." The shadow mass slowly poured over the threshold of the door, filling the room with a freezing, suffocating blackness that extinguished the remaining light. I could feel its cold, weightless presence pressing down on my face, cutting off my air supply as I slipped into unconsciousness, fully believing that I would never wake up. When I finally opened my eyes, it was bright daylight. The blizzard had passed and the sun was shining through the frost-covered window. The bedroom door was wide open, and the heavy oak desk was back in its original position across the room, with no sign of damage or disturbance. The house was completely silent, and the electricity had miraculously returned. I didn't waste a single second. I grabbed my keys, ran outside to the snowmobile, and rode through the deep snow for 3 grueling hours until I reached the main highway. I left the snowmobile at a gas station caught a ride with a passing semi-truck, and never returned to the estate. I later learned from the local sheriff that the previous two caretakers of that property had disappeared without a trace during the winter months, leaving behind all of their belongings and their locked cars sitting in the driveway. The vast wilderness holds secrets that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. And sometimes when you go looking for peace in the deep woods, you find something that refuses to let you leave. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more true horror every week.